Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching What's My Password Again? And while it sounds like a game show, we're actually going to be talking about domain password policies, fine-grained password policies, which is a brand new feature in Server 2008. And while we're here talking about passwords, I thought we should talk a little bit about password management, and we'll throw that in for good measure. So literally in this video, we're going to start off by going into the default domain password policy and making a couple of quick adjustments to it to make it just a touch more secure. But then, as always, anytime we do anything that's more secure, Hank throws a fit. And so we're going to talk about how to let your boss use whatever password he or she wants. And then last but not least, we'll just throw in a little bit of password management and talk you through how to reset passwords and a couple of little odds and ends about those. So let's talk about the default domain password policy. Now, every domain has its own password policy, and we find that in the default domain policy. So as you see here in my little screen capture, I do have the default domain policy up here. And there's very specific things about the password policies that you can alter. You can increase and decrease the security level of your passwords using these things, like how many passwords can a user use in a row, and then by default you can actually specify the user has to have 24 different passwords. They can't use any of the same passwords in the 24 times that they reset or change their password. How long is the password going to last? What is the minimum amount of time that a password can be in existence? The password length, complexity requirements, and this little store password using reversible encryption. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the default settings are usually good enough. A lot of administrators don't mess with these at all because they're fine as they are. So it's going to be up to you as the system administrator, and probably up to higher level management also, to think about, okay, what level of security do we really want? And like I said, you can increase or decrease the level of security using these particular settings in that default domain policy password. Now, let's talk about the complexity requirements here for just a second. You're familiar with these already, I'm pretty sure, because you've probably already had to use complex passwords. Those complexity requirements, things like not having the user's account name in it, be at least 6 characters, contain characters out of the 3 of the 4 following categories. You have to have uppercase, some lowercase, some digits, and some symbols. Well, these complexity requirements are enforced when passwords are changed or created. So let's say that El Bingid goes in and tries to change his password to his daughter's name, for instance, and doesn't have all these password or complexity requirements in it. Well, he's not going to be able to change his password to his daughter's name. Now, if he uses his daughter's name with uppercase, lowercase letters, or numbers or symbols, then we can actually use that, but then he's going to have to change that consecutively 24 times. But the complexity requirements are enforced when passwords are changed or created, because that's really the only time when it really comes into play. So I tell you what, let's go ahead and let's jump on over to Client 1, and let's go into the Globomantic's default password policy. Let's go ahead and let's make just a few quick tweaks. And by the way, I want to talk to you a little bit more about this whole reversible encryption thing. So let's bounce on over there. All right, so here we are back over on Client 1, and let's go ahead and let's go to DC1. It's as good a place as any to make the alterations. We're over here in the Server Manager, and you remember from the last video, we can actually reach the group policy management stuff from here under Features. So let's go ahead and just do that real quick. We'll go into the Domains and then Globomantics, and then here's our default domain policy. We did look at this in the last video as well. Let's go ahead and let's go in and let's edit this guy. And our group policy management editor should pop up here. There we go. All right, so now we're going to go into, and by the way, this is under computer configuration, just so you know. All right, it's actually not under user configuration. We're going to go into policies, into Windows settings, security settings, and then account policies. I'm going to go ahead and stretch this guy out here for just a second so you can see everything that's happening over on this side. So we'll go into the password policy section, and enforcing the password history. Basically, this is going to set up so that the last 24 passwords you can't reuse. Okay, so a user is going to have to go through 24 different passwords before they can start reusing some of their old passwords. Maximum password age, I'm going to change this from 42 days to just 30 days. I think that's going to be good enough. So that way every 30 days a user has to come in and actually make a change to the password. Minimum password age, a password in this instance has to live for 1 day. So if a user goes in and changes their password on Wednesday morning, they won't be able to change it again until Friday morning. Okay? Minimum password length, 7 characters is a fine enough length for password, I think. The complexity requirements are already enabled. Let's go ahead and just double click on this guy, and you can see the explanation. It's the same thing that I have in my instructor notes, and mostly I left them in the instructor notes just so you have an easy reference for those. So nothing really fantastic or new there. Just make sure that policy actually is enabled, and it is by default in Server 2008. Let's take a look at the store passwords using reversible encryption. You'll notice here that the default is set to disabled. Let's go ahead and open this guy up, and let's go ahead and look at the explanation. And here's the kicker, probably a really easy explanation of why this is not enabled by default. This policy provides support for applications that use protocols that require knowledge of the user's password for authentication purposes. Storing passwords, let's go ahead and highlight this one specifically. Storing passwords using reversible encryption is essentially storing plain text versions of the passwords. Yeah, that's right. It makes it less secure. All right, so generally speaking, and I'll just let Microsoft speak for me here, this policy should never be enabled unless applications requirements outweigh the need to protect password information. Now, one thing in computer world that we have to face up to, sometimes we have to let go of our security concerns in order to increase user usability. It's fantastic if you have the greatest, most secure network in the universe, but if nobody can use it, it's not worth anything to you. So there are going to be times where you're going to have to make some compromises between security and usability. We're going to talk a little more about that a little later on. But again, this password policy item, generally we just leave it disabled. Okay, there's no reason to enable it unless, again, you have some kind of application that requires this reversible encryption. And how do you know which applications require that? Well, usually if the application doesn't work after you have implemented this kind of password policy, then that's probably a good sign. A lot of times your application requirements are going to tell you straight out that you're going to require a change in the reversible encryption policy. All right, so nothing really that spectacular here. A lot of this is, probably old hat for you, I'm sure, because I'm sure you've probably worked in a place where you had to use complex passwords. 24 different passwords at a time might be a little draconian. So tell you what, let's go ahead and let's crank that down to say, 15. That should be good enough. So making alterations to the account policies here is not difficult. Let's go into this account lockout policy though, okay? The account lockout policy, what this does is it actually locks the user out if so many invalid attempts are actually made. Now you see right now that these are not defined. So at this point in time, no matter who logs into our network, let's say Hank forgets his password, he can try to log in as many times as he likes, and he's not going to get locked out. Now that's not particularly secure again. So I'll tell you what, let's go here to the account lockout threshold. This is going to determine how many times a user can try to log on and not get locked out. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and specify 10. A lot of administrators will prefer something around 5 or 7. But we're a small company, we know who's walking in the door. But keep this in mind, there are hacker attacks out there that use what we call a brute force attack to basically solve passwords. And if you leave this policy set to 0 or just not enabled at all, well, it's a lot easier for a hacker to try to use a brute force attack in order to guess the password and actually access your system. So you want to set this to at least something, okay? It doesn't have to be real low. It can be, 10, 15, but don't just leave it blank, okay, or leave it undefined. So after 10 logout attempts, you'll notice here when I clicked OK, it gave me some additional suggested value changes. Because the value of the logout threshold is now 10 invalid logon attempts, the settings for the following will be changed to the suggested values. Now right now, our account lockout duration, how long is a user locked out before they can try again to get back into the system. Well, the suggested setting for this is going to be 30 minutes. I'm going to recommend probably more like an hour. But you can specify that depending upon what your best guess is. A lot of times the suggested settings are just fine too. And then the reset account lockout counter after 30 minutes. This will, after 30 minutes, let's say that Lance Benga he basically has to wait 30 minutes before he can try again. And usually that's fine. So we'll tell that okay. So I think it's pretty cool and pretty smart of the guys and gals at Microsoft to specify suggested settings, kind of helping those folks who are new to this kind of world, giving them at least a baseline to start from. You know, generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend any less than 30 minutes for an account lockout duration. If you specify it to like 5 or 1, you know, you're leaving yourself open for a little bit of an attack there. Now, granted, keep in mind that if this is a local user to your network, chances are in order to perform that brute force attack, they're going to have to be on the premises. So that also is a physical security issue, but more about that stuff later on, probably in a completely different course. So before I digress too far, I think we've talked enough about the different password policies here that you're going to need to know absolutely. So let's go ahead and let's bounce back on over to the slides now, and let's talk about how do we allow exceptions for this kind of thing, because I got to tell you what, Hank is going to be really mad about this. So, you know Hank. Hank does not like the fact that he has to use all these newfangled password techniques with symbols and numbers, and it's too much for him to remember, and he doesn't want to have to think up a new password every 30 days. He's got enough to think about running this company, and he just wants to use the name of his horses, and that's it. All right, well, fortunately, we can do something about that. We can use a technique that's called fine-grained password policies. Now, this is, again, something that's new in Server 2008, and we can exempt Hank and anybody else that are going to be members, a part of this executives group that we created a while back, from those default domain password policy settings. So what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the complexity requirements for Hank, and we're also going to extend the expiration date so that Hank and any other user that gets put into the executives group will only have to update their passwords every 3 months. So I think that's going to be okay to have a small amount of users to do that. I know this is kind of a beer and pretzels talk, but a lot of security folks might disagree with me a little bit about that, and they say, well, you know, they're executives, they have access to high-level information, so they really need to have really secure passwords. And yeah, in theory, that's absolutely true. But again, sometimes we have to make security concessions for usability, especially for the people who sign our paychecks. So let's talk about this fine-grained password stuff, all right? Now, normally you only have one password policy setting in your entire domain. But what we can do is we can create these things called password setting objects, and the acronym for that is PSO if you're cool. But we can create multiple password policies for individual users, or even for entire groups of users that users are part of. Now here's the kicker, all right? Your functional level, all right? We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but your domain functional level must be at a 2008 level. What that really means is that all your domain controllers in your network have to be Server 2008. And you know what? When we get into the demonstration on this one, I'll go and I'll show you exactly how to figure out what functional level you're working at too. Now, this isn't as easy as a lot of folks initially think. A lot of the veterans thought, hey, that means we can just go in and start changing the password policy on individual organizational units, and that's not going to be the case. You can't actually use this technique on organizational units, okay? You can attach, or really link, the password settings object to groups. You can link it to users, but you can't attach it to an organizational unit like we would a normal group policy object. Remember, this is not a group policy object, right? This is a PSO, password settings object. So it's going to act a little bit differently than a group policy. Now we're going to go into this thing called ADSI Edit. Now ADSI Edit, I'm going to warn you real quickly here, if you don't know what you're doing, stay out of it, because you can blow up your whole network really fast, really easy if you don't know what you're doing in this. This is a low-level editor that allows you to edit the Active Directory database directly. So what does that translate into? it translates into the fact that this can be a precarious place to go into and start messing around with stuff if you don't understand it and you don't know what you're doing. Now, fortunately, you have an instructor who's going to walk you through each and every step of this, right? So the password settings object is pretty tough to squirrel something up in here. Not impossible, but it's pretty tough. So what we're going to be doing is a fairly simple edit. I'm going to walk you through it step by step. So now we've talked about this a little bit, let's go ahead and move back on over to client 1. Let's go ahead and set this password settings object up for Hank and anybody else that we decide to put into executives. Alright, so we're back over here on client 1 in the remote desktop for DC1. We're currently in the group policy management editor. That's not really what I'd like to be. Let's go ahead and close that guy out. And tell you what, before we make all this happen, let's go ahead and let's go over to client 2, and we'll do this straight from the virtual machine here. Let's go ahead and log off Lance Binga, and let's just see if we can actually get Hank's horse's name to become our password. So first we'll go ahead and we'll log on with Hank's old password here. So go ahead and we'll do a Control-Alt-Delete. And we'll go in here and click on Change a Password. We'll put in Hank's old password. And now we'll try Hank's, well, one of Hank's horse's names. We'll try Gutsy Oats here. Alright, so do all lowercase G-U-T-S-Y. And then we'll try it again. Oops, you know what? I didn't get that right. G-U-T-S-Y-O-A-T-S. Gutsy Oats. And we'll try it again here. And now let's see what we get when we hit the Enter key. We got access denied. So we have our password not working correctly. All right, so if we want to try it just one more time just to make sure here. Yeah, we got nothing. So what we need to do is we need to actually go in and let's go ahead and cancel this out and cancel this. Let's go back over to client 1 and through our remote desktop connection here, let's go ahead and let's create that exception in the password policy for Hank, specifically for all the users that we place into the executives group, so they can pretty much use whatever password they like. Now we can't do this from here in Server Manager. We need to go to the Start menu, we need to go to Administrative Tools, and we need to go into this ADC Edit thing. So here we are in ADC Edit. Now, just so you know, you might need to connect to globalmatics.com. I know you might think it's kind of weird to connect to this particular machine, but this ADC Edit actually allows you to connect to pretty much any of the Active Directory databases that might be on your network. But for right now, we're, of course, connected to globalmatics.com. We'll go into globalmatics.com here, and we'll go into System. And here inside of System, we have our password settings container. So let's go ahead and double click on that guy and open him up. So we have a container here for our password policies. In order to create a new password settings object, a PSO, we right click, select New, and select Object. Now we're going to select the only class that's available, password settings. Big surprise, right? We'll tell it next. Alright, so now we're going to be walking through kind of this little rough wizard type of thing. We're going to create a common name for the password. Now the common name is really kind of a friendly name, so we're going to call this Executives Password Policy. All right, something that's really easy for us to remember. We'll tell it next. Now, a password setting precedence basically determines if a user is part of different groups that have multiple password setting objects applied to them. So let's say that Hank is part of 2 groups, and each of these groups has a different password settings object applied to it. Well, the value in this particular box of the particular password settings object that is highest will win. So we're going to set this guy to 1. That should be good enough. We'll tell it next. Password in reversible encryption status. Now we've talked about that, right? That's a bad thing for security. So what we're going to type in there is false. So this one's going to be true or false. Okay? So we'll tell it next. Password history length for user accounts. This is how many consecutive passwords Hank can use, how many different passwords he can use before he has to think up new ones, right? Hank has, we know, 5 horses, all right? So Hank can use, every time that he has to change his password, a different name of a different horse for 5 times, okay, before he can go back and start using the first horse's name. Does that make sense? Right, so if Hank has 5 horses and he starts going down his list, let's say he's using Gutsy Oats this time, well, he has to come up with 4 other horse names in consecutive order before he can come back and use Gutsy Oats again. All right, so we'll tell it next. Password complexity status for user accounts. Well, that's that whole set of complexity requirements I was talking to you earlier about. And again, this is another one of those things. So we're going to put in here false for this one as well. And now minimum password length for user accounts. Let's do 4 characters. Okay, I know it's not very high. I don't know how long Hank's horses' names actually are. I know Gutsy Oats, that's all I know. So it's going to be 4 characters. Minimum password age. How long can a password actually last? All right, so here's the deal. For these duration items, we have to use a very specific syntax, which is the amount of days with a colon, hours, colon, minutes, colon, and seconds. So basically the value I put in here is exactly 1 day, no hours, no minutes, and no seconds. Okay? So the password that he creates has to live at least 1 day before he can change it again. We'll tell it next. And now what is the maximum password age for user accounts? So we're going to put in here the number of days, 90, colon, 00 for the hours, 00 for the minutes, colon, 00 for the seconds. Okay? So this is going to be good for 90 days before Hank has to change his password to a name of a different horse. All right, we'll tell it next. All right, lockout threshold for lockout of user accounts. How many times can Hank try to log in before he gets locked out of his own account? Well, I'll tell you what. Let's not make Hank too angry. Let's give him 20 chances. All right? We'll give Hank 20 chances before he has to come get us to reset his password. So let's go ahead and tell it next. All right, so now the observation window. Let me tell you about what this is. This is the amount of time that can go by that Hank gets to log in inside of. So let's say that Hank tries his 20 attempts in 20 minutes. Okay? So we'll give Hank 20 minutes. You know, basically the Windows will watch for from the time that he first tries to log on. If he tries all 20 attempts in 20 minutes, then he'll get locked out. Okay? Now we need to specify the right value. So 0 days, 0 hours, 20 minutes, and 0 seconds. Okay? All right, now we'll tell it next. And now let's say that Hank does try 20 times in 20 minutes and gets locked out. Well, how long is Hank going to be locked out for? Well, chances are, if he gets locked out, it'll be about 5 minutes before he calls you on the phone. All right? So in that case, it shouldn't take that long. But I'll tell you what, just in case someone is trying to hack his account, let's go ahead and lock out that account for 60 minutes. Okay? So we'll put it in here, 0 days, 0 hours. Actually, you know what? Since it's 60 minutes, it should be like 1 hour, right? So we'll do 0, 1, and then 0 minutes, and let's do 5 seconds, okay? All right, so we'll tell it next. Now, before we hit finish, because right now, I know you're going to want to think, okay, I'm done, right? I'm done. No, you're not. Now, we need to decide, actually, I should say we need to link this password object to the appropriate group. So we need to click here on More Attributes, okay? And we need to edit this very first attribute. And in the attribute box, we need to put in the distinguished name of the group that we're going to be linking this password settings object to. Now, let me tell you, you remember that whole CN equals OU equals DC equals thing that we did when we were creating our script and we were actually adding in users from the command line? Well, that's the kind of stuff that we need. Let me show you a really easy way to get to that. Let's go here to the Server Manager, and we're going to go into the Roles section underneath Active Directory Domain Services, Active Directory Users and Computers, Globomantics, New York OU, New York Users, we'll go into the executives item, and we want the distinguished name, the database name of this executives group. I'm going to go here to the View menu and turn on Advanced Features. Okay, this Advanced Features item is going to give me more stuff that I can play with and more detail about the objects here in my domain. Let's go to the New York OU, New York users again. Looks like we had to go back in here and go into Executives, right-click on Executives, and go into the Executives properties. Now here in the Executives properties, you see this Attribute Manager. Let's go in here. The Attribute Manager, here are the actual database entries for this particular object. And here's our distinguished name. All right, so let's go ahead and double-click right here on Distinguished Name. And I'm going to select it all by just using my mouse here, and I'm going to do a Control-C on the keyboard. Okay, I'm going to copy this CN Executives, OU Executives, NY Users, OU New York, DC Global Matics, all that stuff that we used back when we learned how to add users in the command line, right? So we're grabbing the distinguished name and going back now to Add Edit. Now, what we need to do is we need to select the right property to add in our name to. So we're going to click here on Select Property to View. We're going to scroll down here, and we're going to find PSO applies to. Okay? So we need to specify which group or user we're going to be applying this to. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to paste in what we just grabbed from Active Directory users and computers, right? And you'll notice here the syntax says DN, stands for distinguished name. And we'll click here on Add to add in the executives into the values. Now you could add in additional values, additional users and or groups if you wanted to here, but this is the only people that we want this particular PSO to be applied to. So now we'll go ahead and we'll tell it OK, and we'll click on Finish. Whoops, looks like I typed something wrong in here. The value for the attribute was not acceptable in the range of values for our lockout observation window. Well, okay, let's go ahead and let's go back to our lockout observation window. Oh yeah, looks like something happened there. Looks like I didn't type it in right, or I'm pretty sure I did, but that's okay. We'll just fix it up here real quick, and we'll move right along. And there we go. So we have created successfully our executives password policy. So now let's go ahead and let's bounce on over to our client 2 machine, and let's see if this worked. Alright, so here we are back over on client 2. We'll just go back in here and do a Control-Alt-Delete. We'll change a password. And let's see if we can get old Hank's password here to change up here to something that's a little easier. And again, I'm just going to use Gutsy, G-U-T-S-Y, as an example. Let's see how I did. And there we go. So now the password has now been changed to Gutsy, and everything has worked A-OK. So you notice that that process wasn't the most difficult thing in the universe. I mean, you do have to watch out for that one attribute. Make sure you specify that it applies to that particular group so that this can actually work. All right, so now that we have talked a lot about the default passwords and how to set up basically a password override through those password setting objects, I want to talk to you a little bit about password management overall. So let's bounce back on over to the slides. So the password policy exceptions to the PSOs are all fine, well and good, but it doesn't make too much difference because everybody is going to forget their password at one point in time or another. And look, we just have to be forgiving as system administrators and understand that that's going to be part of the gig. Right? So resetting the passwords, it's really easy though. All you do is go into Active Directory users and computers. You find that user account that needs the password reset. You right click and select Reset Password. I mean, nothing tough here. You change it to something that's easy to communicate, and then you tell the user the new password. Now I want you to keep something in mind here. When you reset the password, make sure that that password you're resetting it to abides by the rules of either the domain or the PSO that you just created. So if you create a PSO like we did for Hank and the executives, then you can pretty much change it and reset the password to whatever you want. It's no big deal. But if it's a standard user like El Binga who does not have that PSO applied to him, then we need to make sure that we abide by those complexity requirements that we were talking about earlier. But don't forget to tell the user that new password. And the best practice is to go back into the user accounts and then force the user to change their password on the next logon. Don't leave it to something that's really simple and something that's easily communicated, especially if you're emailing the password or telling someone the password that is within earshot of another employee. Just go ahead and make sure that they have to go in and change it when they log in with that new password. Now, here's a new thing, okay? Some of you might be familiar with EFS, or encrypting file system. Users have the ability to encrypt a file so that only they can look at it. And in previous versions of Server, if a user has a file that's encrypted and you reset the password from an administrator standpoint, that user would no longer be able to get back to the file. And that was a problem. In Server 2008, if you're in a Server 2008 environment, when a password is reset, the user still gets access to their encrypted files. So I think that's way cool. That's something that they should have done a long time ago, and a big round of applause for Microsoft on that one, because they did good for that one. So I just wanted to mention that to you. Once one of the little niceties that's going to make your job as an administrator just a little bit easier. So tell you what, let's bounce back on over to Client 1, and I just want to talk you through how to reset a password real quick, and then also how to make sure that the user has to change their password the next time they log on with it. Alright, so we're back over here on Client 1, and again we're still pretty much where we were with DC1. So let's go ahead and let's close out of ADC Edit because we're done with it. And now let's go into Active Directory users and computers here. And let's go to our New York OU. Let's go to our NY users, and let's go into sales. And so we can take, let's do A Childs. All right, so let's right click on A Childs and let's select Reset Password. And now I just specify a password that matches in. Now this is a standard user. This is not an executive. So I have to make sure that my password fits in with those complexity requirements, right? And so you see here that we have this user must change password next logon checkbox. All right, well, we want to do that. So we need to leave that check marked. Now, if they've tried to log in too many times, then we also might need to unlock the user's account. Now, right now, this user's account isn't even locked, so it's no big deal. So we don't have to check this box. It's not going to hurt anything if you do, but this user's account is unlocked already. So the first time that a user calls you up or stops you in the hallway and says, hey, you know what, I can't get into my account, when you reset their password, make sure that this little guy is check marked. I'll tell this one OK, and that resets the password for A Childs. I'll tell that one OK. I'm going to right click here and go into the properties real quick. We can also unlock accounts here in the account panel. Also, the user must change password next logon. You'll notice that the user has not logged on yet, so they have not cleared that checkbox by changing their password. And here's a couple other interesting things. User cannot change password, and password never expires. If you have a user that just cannot keep a thought in their heads and just cannot remember a password, well, you might want to use one or these two. Password never expires is usually not a good security move, though. However, we might need to create what we call a service account eventually. Now, a service account is a specific kind of user account that we use for things like database applications and other types of applications. And if we create a service account, which is basically nothing more than a standard user account, we're probably going to check user cannot change password, password never expires, and also clear user must change password at the next logon. Sometimes we might need to disable an account. Let's say a user leaves the company or goes on vacation. We might disable their account while they're on vacation just to make sure that that account isn't hanging out there and somebody didn't grab the password somewhere along the line. So it might not be a bad thing. Smart cards are becoming more prevalent in a lot of places, so we might need to also include smart card options here. So there's just a lot of stuff in here about passwords and logons and such that you might want to just kind of keep in the back of your head that they're there in case an occasion to use these ever does arise, and it will, I guarantee. Alright, so I just wanted to talk to you just a second about doing some quick account management, some password management. Since we've been talking about passwords, I thought this was kind of a natural place to kind of jump back in here and talk to you about it. Because, I mean, even though Hank is exempt from the default domain policy, that doesn't mean he's not going to forget his password. Okay? He might go away for 2 weeks on a rodeo vacation and come back and not remember which horse's name he used. So we might need to go in and reset Hank's account every so often. Alright, so that pretty much wraps us up, friends. Let's bounce on over back to the slides, and I want to go through some vocabulary with you and our what we covered slide, and then we'll move on to the next video. Alright, so let's just go back through our critical vocabulary here. The ADC edit is a low-level utility that we use to edit the Active Directory database directly rather than using the GUI tools. You know, things like Server Manager and whatnot. The fine-grained password policy is a new feature, Server 2008, that allows an override of the domain password policy requirements. And we, remember, apply that to specific users and groups, not to organizational units, okay? By the way, if you want to apply one of those password setting objects to an entire organizational group, here's what you'd have to do. You'd have to select all your users in that organizational unit and then add them to a specific group, okay? But chances are you're probably not going to use this fine-grained password policy item a lot, just for very specific select users. PSOs, password settings object, right? Remember that this is an Active Directory object that we create inside of ADC Edit that allows for an alternative password policy to be applied to a user or group. It's really what makes the whole fine-grained password policy thing work. And don't forget about the Server 2008 functional level. This is an operating mode that requires that all domain controllers in your network to be Server 2008. You know what? We didn't look at that, did we? Let me go show you how that works real quick. I'm going to bounce back on over to the server, just a real quick check and see what functional level we're actually operating at. Alright, back over here on the DC, just a real quick look. It's not much to it. We're here underneath Active Directory Domain Services, Users and Computers, and here's Globomantics. So I'm going to select Globomantics, right-click on it, and then select Raise Domain Functional Level. You'll see that we are currently at Windows Server 2008. Now, if we were at Server 2003, let's say that you were in an environment, in a corporation that was still running Server 2003 domain controller somewhere in-house, well, in order to use this fine-grained password policy, you're going to have to raise the functional level, which means you're going to have to get rid of your Server 2003 domain controllers and replace them, or upgrade them, by the way. You can upgrade from 2003 to 2008 and bring all of your domain controllers up to Server 2008 level. All right, so just want to show you that real quick. Again, you just right-click on your domain and then select Raise Functional Level, and I'll tell you exactly what functional level you're operating at. All right, back to our review. All right, so back over to where we were talking about here. We just did a quick look in remembrance of our Server 2008 functional level. Let's talk about what you should be able to do after you watch this video. Now you should be able to alter the default domain policy settings to increase or decrease password requirements and settings. You're going to have to do some judgment calls on some of that. You should be able to now locate the functional level for a domain in Active Directory users and computers, and I just showed you that, right? You should be able to create a PSO, password settings object, by using ADC Edit to override the domain password policy settings for very specific users and groups, not organizational units, right? Only for users, only for groups, not OUs. And last but not least, you should now be able to reset a user's password and force the user to change their password on the next logon attempt. Alright friends, well you know what? That wraps up this video. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how to delegate some control. Because now that you know about password policies and how to reset passwords, that means that you now have the responsibility to reset someone's password. However, is that what you want to do all day? I mean, in some companies, you might be resetting passwords 10, 15, 20 times a day. And yeah, it doesn't take very long to do it, right? But I'm going to show you how to give control of resetting passwords to someone else. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you in that next one.